This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share the videos. This audiobook is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 8, The Last Phase, 2. Part 5, The Question of Minorities, the Muslim League, Mr. M.A. Jinnah. The development and growth of the Muslim League during the last 7 years has been an unusual phenomenon. Started in 1906 with British encouragement and in order to keep away the new generation of Muslims from the National Congress, it remained a small upper-class organization controlled by feudal elements. It had no influence on the Muslim masses and was hardly known by them. By its very constitution it was limited to a small group and a permanent leadership which perpetuated itself. Even so, events and the growing middle class among the Muslims pushed it in the direction of the Congress. World War I and the fate of the Turkish Caliphate, and the Muslim holy places produced a powerful impression on the Muslims of India, and made them intensely anti-British. The Muslim League, constituted as it was, could not offer any guidance or leadership to these awakened and excited masses. Indeed, the League suffered from an attack of nerves and practically faded away. A new Muslim organization grew up in close cooperation with the Congress, the Caliphate Committee. Large numbers of Muslims also joined the Congress and worked through it. After the first non-cooperation movement of 1920-23, the Caliphate Committee also began to fade away as its very raison d'etre had disappeared, the Turkish Caliphate. The Muslim masses drifted away from political activity, as also the Hindu masses to a lesser extent. But a very considerable number of Muslims, chiefly of the middle classes, continued to function through the Congress. During this period a number of petty Muslim organizations functioned spasmodically, often coming into conflict with each other. They had no mass affiliations, no political importance, except such as was given to them by the British government. Their chief function was to demand special privileges and protection for the Muslims in the legislatures and services. In this matter they did represent a definite Muslim viewpoint, for there was a background of resentment and fear among the Muslims at the superior position of the Hindus in education, services, and industry, as well as in numbers. Mr. M.A. Jinnah retired from Indian politics, and indeed from India, and settled down in England. During the Second Civil Disobedience Movement of 1930, the response from the Muslims was very considerable, though less than in 1920-23. Among those who were jailed in connection with this movement there were at least 10,000 Muslims. The Northwest Frontier Province, which is an almost entirely Muslim province, 95% Muslims, played a leading and remarkable part in this movement. This was largely due to the work and personality of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the unquestioned and beloved leader of the Pathans in this province. Of all the remarkable happenings in India in recent times, nothing is more astonishing than the way in which Abdul Ghaffar Khan made his turbulent and quarrelsome people accept peaceful methods of political action, involving enormous suffering. That suffering was indeed terrible, and has left a trail of bitter memories, and yet their discipline and self-control were such that no act of violence was committed by the Pathans against the government forces or others opposed to them. When it is remembered that a Pathan loves his gun more than his brother, is easily excited, and has long had a reputation for killing at the slightest provocation, this self-discipline appears little short of miraculous. The frontier province, under Abdul Ghaffar Khan's leadership, stood firmly by the side of the National Congress, so also did a large number of the politically conscious middle-class Muslims elsewhere. Among the peasantry and workers, Congress influence was considerable, especially in provinces like the United Provinces, which had an advanced agrarian and workers' program. But it was nonetheless true that the Muslim masses as a whole were reverting vaguely to their old local and feudal leadership, which came to them in the guise of protectors of Muslim interests as against Hindus and others. The communal problem, as it was called, was one of adjusting the claims of the minorities and giving them sufficient protection from majority action. Minorities in India, it must be remembered, are not racial or national minorities as in Europe, they are religious minorities. Racially India is a patchwork and a curious mixture, but no racial questions have arisen or can arise in India. Religion transcends these racial differences, which fade into one another and are often hard to distinguish. Religious barriers are obviously not permanent, as conversions can take place from one religion to another, and a person changing his religion does not thereby lose his racial background or his cultural and linguistic inheritance. Latterly, religion, in any real sense of the word, has played little part in Indian political conflicts, though the word is often enough used and exploited. Religious differences, as such, do not come in the way, for there is a great deal of mutual tolerance for them. In political matters, religion has been displaced by what is called communalism, a narrow group mentality basing itself on a religious community but in reality concerned with political power and patronage for the interested group. Repeated efforts were made by the Congress as well as other organizations to settle this communal problem with the consent of the various groups concerned. Some partial success was achieved, but there was always a basic difficulty: the presence and policy of the British government. Naturally, the British did not favor any real settlement which would strengthen the political movement, now grown to mass proportions, against them. It was a triangle with the government in a position to play off one side against the other, by giving special privileges. If the other parties had been wise enough, they could have overcome even this obstacle, but they lacked wisdom and foresight. Whenever a settlement was almost reached, the government would take some step which upset the balance. There was no dispute about the usual provisions for minority protection, such as the League of Nations used to lay down. All those were agreed to and much more. Religion, culture, language, the fundamental rights of the individual and the group, were all to be protected and assured by basic constitutional provisions in a democratic constitution applying equally to all. Apart from this, the whole history of India was witness of the toleration and even encouragement of minorities and of different racial groups. There is nothing in Indian history to compare with the bitter religious feuds and persecutions that prevailed in Europe. So we did not have to go abroad for ideas of religious and cultural toleration; these were inherent in Indian life. In regard to individual and political rights and civil liberties, we were influenced by the ideas of the French and American revolutions, as also by the constitutional history of the British Parliament. Socialistic ideas, and the influence of the Soviet Revolution, came in later to give a powerful economic turn to our thoughts. Apart from full protection of all such rights of the individual and the group, it was common ground that every effort should be made by the state, as well as by private agencies, to remove all invidious social and customary barriers, which came in the way of the full development of the individual as well as any group, and that educationally and economically backward classes should be helped to get rid of their disabilities as rapidly as possible. This applied especially to the depressed classes. It was further laid down that women should share in every way with men in the privileges of citizenship. What remained? Fear that bigger numbers might politically overwhelm a minority. Normally speaking, numbers meant the peasantry and the workers, the masses of all religious faiths, who had long been exploited not only by foreign rule but by their own upper classes. Having assured the protection of religion and culture, etc., the major problems that were bound to come up were economic ones which had nothing to do with a person's religion. Class conflicts there might well be, but not religious conflicts, except in so far as religion itself represented some vested interest. Nevertheless, people had grown so accustomed to think along lines of religious cleavage, and were continually being encouraged to do so by communal religious organizations and government action, that the fear of the major religious community, that is the Hindus, swamping others, continued to exercise the minds of many Muslims. It was not clear how even a majority could injure the interests of a huge minority like the Muslims, concentrated mostly in certain parts of the country, which would be autonomous. But fear is not reasonable. Separate electorates for Muslims, and later for other and smaller groups, were introduced and additional seats were given to them in excess of their population. But even excess in representation in a popular assembly could not convert a minority into a majority. Indeed, separate electorates made matters a little worse, for the protected group for the majority electorate lost interest in it, and there was little occasion for mutual consideration and adjustment which inevitably takes place in a joint electorate when a candidate has to appeal to every group. The Congress went further and declared that if there was any disagreement between the majority and a religious minority on any issue touching the special interests of that minority, it should not be decided by majority votes but should be referred to an impartial judicial tribunal, or even an international tribunal, whose decision should be final. It is difficult to conceive what greater protection could be given to any religious minority or group under any democratic system. It must be remembered also that in some provinces Muslims were actually in a majority, and as the provinces were autonomous, the Muslim majority was more or less free to function as it chose, subject only to certain all India considerations. In the central government Muslims would also inevitably have an important share. In the Muslim-majority provinces this communal religious problem was reversed, for their protection was demanded by the other minority groups, such as Hindu and Sikh, as against the Muslim majority. Thus in the Punjab, there was a Muslim-Hindu-Sikh triangle. If there was a separate electorate for Muslims, then others claimed special protection for themselves also. Having once introduced separate electorates, there was no end to the ramifications and compartments and difficulties that arose from them. Obviously, the granting of weightage in representation to one group could only be done at the cost of some other group, which had its representation reduced below its population figures. This produced a fantastic result, especially in Bengal, where, chiefly because of excessive European representation, the seats allotted to the general electorate were absurdly reduced. Thus, the intelligentsia of Bengal, which had played such a notable part in Indian politics and the struggle for freedom, suddenly realized that it had a very weak position in the provincial legislature fixed and limited by statute. The Congress made many mistakes, but these were in relatively minor questions of approach or tactics. It was obvious that even for purely political reasons, the Congress was eager and anxious to bring about a communal solution and thus remove a barrier to progress. There was no such eagerness in the purely communal organizations, for their chief reason for existence was to emphasize the particular demands of their respective groups, and this had led to a certain vested interest in the status quo. Though predominantly Hindu in membership, the Congress had large numbers of Muslims on its rolls, as well as all other religious groups like Sikhs, Christians, etc. It was thus forced to think in national terms. For it, the dominating issue was national freedom and the establishment of an independent democratic state. It realized that in a vast and varied country like India, a simple type of democracy, giving full powers to a majority to curb or overrule minority groups in all matters, was not satisfactory or desirable, even if it could be established. It wanted unity, of course, and took it for granted, but it saw no reason why the richness and variety of India's cultural life should be regimented after a single pattern. Hence a large measure of autonomy was agreed to, as well as safeguards for cultural growth and individual and group freedom. But on two fundamental questions the Congress stood firm: national unity and democracy. These were the foundations on which it had been founded, and its very growth for half a century had emphasized these. The Congress organization is certainly one of the most democratic organizations that I know of anywhere in the world, both in theory and practice. Through its tens of thousands of local committees spread out all over the country, it had trained the people in democratic ways and achieved striking success in this. The fact that a dominating and very popular personality like Gandhi was connected with it did not lessen that essential democracy of the Congress. In times of crisis and struggle, there was an inevitable tendency to look to the leader for guidance, as in every country, and such crises were frequent. Nothing is more absurd than to call the Congress an authoritarian organization, and it is interesting to note that such charges are usually made by high representatives of British authority, which is the essence of autocracy and authoritarianism in India. The British government had also stood in the past, in theory at least, for Indian unity and democracy. It took pride in the fact that its rule had brought about the political unity of India, even though that unity was one of common subjection. It told us further that it was training us in the methods and processes of democracy. But curiously enough, its policy has directly led to the denial of both unity and democracy. In August 1940, the Congress executive was compelled to declare that the policy of the British government in India is a direct encouragement of and incitement to civil discord and strife. Responsible spokesmen of the British government began to tell us openly that perhaps the unity of India might have to be sacrificed in favor of some new arrangement, and that democracy was not suited to India. That was the only answer they had left to India's demand for independence and the establishment of a democratic state. That answer, incidentally, tells us that the British have failed, on their own showing, in the two major objectives they had set themselves in India. It took them a century and a half to realize this. We failed in finding a solution for the communal problem agreeable to all parties concerned, and certainly we must share the blame as we have to shoulder the consequences for this failure. But how does one get everybody to agree to any important proposition or change? There are always feudal and reactionary elements who are opposed to all change, and there are those who want political, economic, and social change. In between these are varying groups. If a small group can exercise a veto on change, then surely there can never be any change. When it is the policy of the ruling power to set up such groups and encourage them, even though they may represent an infinitesimal proportion of the population, then change can only come through successful revolution. It is obvious that there are any number of feudal and reactionary groups in India, some native to the soil, and some created and nurtured by the British. In numbers they may be small, but they have the backing of the British power. Among the Muslims, various organizations grew up, apart from the Muslim League. One of the older and more important ones was the Jamiat-ul-Ulama, which consisted of divines and old-fashioned scholars from all over India. Traditional and conservative in its general outlook, and necessarily religious, it was yet politically advanced and anti-imperialist. On the political plane it often cooperated with the Congress, and many of its members were also members of the Congress and functioned through its organization. The Ahmednagar organization was founded later and was strongest in the Punjab. This represented chiefly lower middle-class Muslims and had considerable influence on the masses also in particular areas. The Momeens, principally the weaver class, though large in numbers, were the poorest and most backward among the Muslims and were weak and badly organized. They were friendly to the Congress and opposed to the Muslim League. Being weak they avoided political action. In Bengal there was the Krishak, peasant Sabha. Both the Jamiat-ul-Ulama and the Ahmednagars often cooperated with the Congress in its normal work and its more aggressive campaigns against the British government, and suffered for it. The chief Muslim organization which has never come into conflict, other than verbal, with the British authorities, is the Muslim League, which throughout subsequent changes and developments and even when large numbers joined it, never shed its upper-class feudal leadership. There were also the Shia Muslims organized separately, but rather vaguely, chiefly for the purpose of making political demands. In the early days of Islam, in Arabia, a bitter dispute about the succession to the caliphate led to a schism and two groups or sects emerged, the Sunnis and Shias. That quarrel perpetuated itself and still separates the two, though the schism ceased to have any political meaning. Sunnis are in a majority in India and in the Islamic countries, except in Iran, where Shias are in a majority. Religious conflicts have sometimes taken place between the two groups. The Shia organization in India as such kept apart and differed from the Muslim League. It was in favor of joint electorates for all. But there are many prominent Shias in the League. All these Muslim organizations, as well as some others, but not including the Muslim League, joined hands to promote the Azad Muslim Conference, which was a kind of joint Muslim front opposed to the Muslim League. This conference held a very representative and successful first session in Delhi in 1940. The chief Hindu communal organization is the Hindu Mahasabha, the counterpart of the Muslim League, but relatively less important. It is as aggressively communal as the League, but it tries to cover up its extreme narrowness of outlook by using some kind of vague national terminology, though its outlook is more revivalist than progressive. It is peculiarly unfortunate in some of its leaders who indulge in irresponsible and violent diatribes, as indeed do some of the Muslim League leaders also. This verbal warfare, indulged in on both sides, is a constant irritant. It takes the place of action. The Muslim League's communal attitude was often difficult and unreasonable in the past, but no less unreasonable was the attitude of the Hindu Mahasabha. The Hindu minorities in the Punjab and Sindh, and the dominant Sikh group in the Punjab, were often obstructive and came in the way of a settlement. British policy was to encourage and emphasize these differences and to give importance to communal organizations as against the Congress. One test of the importance of a group or party, or at any rate of its hold on the people, is an election. During the general elections in India in 1937 the Hindu Mahasabha failed completely, it was nowhere in the picture. The Muslim League did better but on the whole its showing was poor, especially in the predominantly Muslim provinces. In the Punjab and Sindh it failed completely, in Bengal it met with only partial success. In the northwest frontier province Congress formed a ministry later. In the Muslim minority provinces, the League met with greater success on the whole, but there were also independent Muslim groups as well as Muslims elected as congressmen. Then began a remarkable campaign on behalf of the Muslim League against the Congress governments in the provinces and the Congress organization itself. Day after day it was repeated that the governments were committing atrocities on the Muslims. The governments contained Muslim ministers also, but they were not members of the Muslim League. What these atrocities were, it was not usually stated, or some petty local incidents, which had nothing to do with the government, were distorted and magnified. Some minor errors of some departments, which were soon rectified, became atrocities. Sometimes entirely false and baseless charges were made. Even a report was issued, fantastic in its contents and having little to do with any facts. Congress governments invited those who made the charges to supply particulars for investigation or to come and inquire themselves with government help. No one took advantage of these offers. But the campaign continued unchecked. Early in 1940, soon after the resignation of the Congress ministers, the then Congress President, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, wrote to Mr. M. A. Jinnah and also made a public statement inviting the Muslim League to place any charges against the Congress governments before the Federal Court of Inquiry and Decision. Mr. Jinnah declined this offer, and referred to the possibility of a royal commission being appointed for the purpose. There was no question of any such commission being appointed, and only the British government could do so. Some of the British governors, who had functioned during the regime of the Congress governments, declared publicly that they had found nothing objectionable in the treatment of minorities. Under the Act of 1935, they had been especially empowered to protect minorities if any such need arose. I had made a close study of Nazi methods of propaganda since Hitler's rise to power, and I was astonished to find something very similar taking place in India. A year later, in 1938, when Czechoslovakia had to face the Sudetenland crisis, the Nazi methods employed there were studied and referred to with approval by Muslim League spokesmen. A comparison was drawn between the position of Sudetenland Germans and Indian Muslims. Violence and incitements in speeches and in some newspapers became marked. A Congress Muslim minister was stabbed, and there was no condemnation of this from any Muslim League leader, in fact it was condoned. Other exhibitions of violence frequently took place. I was terribly depressed by these developments and by the general lowering of the standards of public life. Violence, vulgarity, and irresponsibility were on the increase, and it appeared that they were approved of by responsible leaders of the Muslim League. I wrote to some of these leaders, and begged them to check this tendency, but with no success. So far as the Congress governments were concerned, it was obviously to their interest to win over every minority or other group, and they tried hard to do so. Indeed, complaints arose from some quarters that they were showing undue favor to the Muslims at the expense of other groups. But it was not a question of a particular grievance which could be remedied, or a reasonable consideration of any matter. There was a regular campaign on the part of members or sympathizers of the Muslim League to make the Muslim masses believe that something terrible was happening, and that the Congress was to blame. What that terrible thing was nobody seemed to know. But surely there must be something behind all this shouting and cursing, if not here then elsewhere. During by-elections the cry raised was Islam in danger, and voters were asked to take their oaths on the Holy Book to vote for the Muslim League candidate. All this had an undoubted effect on the Muslim masses. And yet it is surprising how many resisted it. The League won most by-elections, lost some. Even when they won, there was a substantial minority of Muslim voters who went against them, being influenced more by the Congress agrarian program. But for the first time in its history the Muslim League got a mass backing and began to develop into a mass organization. Much as I regretted what was happening, I welcomed this development in a way, as I thought that it might lead ultimately to a change in the feudal leadership, and that more progressive elements would come forward. The real difficulty thus far had been the extreme political and social backwardness of the Muslims, which made them liable to exploitation by reactionary leaders. Mr. M. A. Jinnah himself was more advanced than most of his colleagues of the Muslim League. Indeed, he stood head and shoulders above them and had therefore become the indispensable leader. From public platforms he confessed his great dissatisfaction with the opportunism, and sometimes even worse failings, of his colleagues. He knew well that a great part of the advanced, selfless, and courageous element among the Muslims had joined and worked with the Congress. And yet, some destiny or course of events had thrown him among the very people for whom he had no respect. He was their leader, but he could only keep them together by becoming himself a prisoner to their reactionary ideologies. Not that he was an unwilling prisoner, so far as the ideologies were concerned, for despite his external modernism, he belonged to an older generation which was hardly aware of modern political thought or development. Of economics, which overshadow the world today, he appeared to be entirely ignorant. The extraordinary occurrences that had taken place all over the world since World War I had apparently had no effect on him. He had left the Congress when the organization had taken a political leap forward. The gap had widened as the Congress developed an economic and mass outlook. But Mr. Jinnah seemed to have remained ideologically in that identical place where he stood a generation ago, or rather he had gone further back, for now he condemned both India's unity and democracy. They would not live, he has stated, under any system of government that was based on the nonsensical notion of Western democracy. It took him a long time to realize that what he had stood for throughout a fairly long life was nonsensical. Mr. Jinnah is a lone figure even in the Muslim League, keeping apart from his closest co-workers, widely but distantly respected, more feared than liked. About his ability as a politician there is no doubt, but somehow that ability is tied up with the peculiar conditions of British rule in India today. He shines as a lawyer-politician, as a tactician, as one who thinks that he holds the balance between nationalist India and the British power. If conditions were different, and he had to face real problems, political and economic, it is difficult to say how far his ability would carry him. Perhaps he is himself doubtful of this, although he has no small opinion of himself. This may be an explanation for that subconscious urge in him against change, to keep things going as they are, and to avoid discussion and the calm consideration of problems with people who do not wholly agree with him. He fits into this present pattern. Whether he or anybody else will fit into a new pattern, it is difficult to say. What passion moves him? What objective does he strive for? Or is it that he has no dominating passion except the pleasure he has in playing a fascinating political game of chess in which he often has an opportunity to say check? He seems to have a hatred for the Congress which has grown with the years. His aversions and dislikes are obvious, but what does he like? With all his strength and tenacity, he is a strangely negative person whose appropriate symbol might well be a no. Hence all attempts to understand his positive aspect fail, and one cannot come to grips with it. Since British rule came to India, Muslims have produced few outstanding figures of the modern type. They have produced some remarkable men, but as a rule, these represented the continuation of the old culture and tradition and did not easily fit in with modern developments. This incapacity to march with the changing times and adapt themselves culturally and otherwise to a new environment was not of course due to any innate failing. It derived from certain historical causes, from the delay in the development of a new industrial middle class, and the excessively feudal background of the Muslims, which blocked up avenues of development and prevented the release of talent. In Bengal the backwardness of the Muslims was most marked, but this was obviously due to two causes: the destruction of their upper classes during the early days of British rule, and the fact that the vast majority were converts from the lowest class of Hindus, who had long been denied opportunities of growth and progress. In northern India the cultured upper-class Muslims were tied up with their old traditional ways as well as the land system. In recent years there has been a marked change and a fairly rapid development of a new middle class among Indian Muslims, but even now they lag far behind Hindus and others in science and industry. The Hindus are backward also, sometimes even more hidebound and tied up with traditional ways of thought and practice than the Muslims, but nevertheless they have produced some very eminent men in science, industry, and other fields. The small Parsi community has also produced outstanding leaders of modern industry. Mr. Jinnah's family, it is interesting to note, was originally Hindu. Both among Hindus and Muslims a good deal of talent and ability has in the past gone into government service, as that was the most attractive avenue open. With the growth of the political movement for freedom, that attraction became less, and able, earnest, and courageous persons were drawn into the Congress. Thus, many of the best types of Muslims came into it. In more recent years, young Muslims joined the socialist and communist parties also. Apart from all these ardent and progressive persons, Muslims were very poor in the quality of their leaders, and were inclined to look to government service alone for advancement. Mr. Jinnah was a different type. He was able, tenacious, and not open to the lure of office, which had been such a failing of so many others. His position in the Muslim League, therefore, became unique and he was able to command the respect which was denied to many others prominent in the League. Unfortunately, his tenacity prevented him from opening his mind to any new ideas, and his unquestioned hold on his own organization made him intolerant both of his own dissidents and of other organizations. He became the Muslim League. But a question arose: as the League was becoming a mass organization, how long could this feudal leadership with outmoded ideas continue? When I was Congress President, I wrote to Mr. Jinnah on several occasions and requested him to tell us exactly what he would like us to do. I asked him what the League wanted and what its definite objectives were. I also wanted to know what the grievances of the League were against the Congress governments. The idea was that we might clarify matters by correspondence and then discuss personally the important points that had arisen in it. Mr. Jinnah sent me long replies, but failed to enlighten me. It was extraordinary how he avoided telling me, or anyone else, exactly what he wanted or what the grievances of the League were. Repeatedly, we exchanged letters, and yet always there was the same vagueness and inconclusiveness, and I could get nothing definite. This surprised me very much and made me feel a little helpless. It seemed as if Mr. Jinnah did not want to commit himself in any way and was not at all eager for a settlement. Subsequently, Gandhiji and others amongst us met Mr. Jinnah several times. They talked for hours but never got beyond a preliminary stage. Our proposal was that representatives of the Congress and the League should meet and discuss all their mutual problems. Mr. Jinnah said that this could only be done after we recognized publicly that the Muslim League was the sole representative organization of the Muslims of India, and the Congress should consider itself a purely Hindu organization. This created an obvious difficulty. We recognized, of course, the importance of the League, and because of that, we had approached it. But how could we ignore many other Muslim organizations in the country, some closely associated with us? Also, there were large numbers of Muslims in the Congress itself and in our highest executive. To admit Mr. Jinnah's claim meant in effect to push out our old Muslim colleagues from the Congress and declare that the Congress was not open to them. It was to change the fundamental character of the Congress, and from a national organization, open to all, convert it into a communal body. That was inconceivable for us. If the Congress had not already been there, we would have had to build up a new national organization open to every Indian. We could not understand Mr. Jinnah's insistence on this and refusal to discuss any other matter. Again, we could only conclude that he did not want any settlement, nor did he want to commit himself in any way. He was satisfied in letting matters drift, and in expecting that he could get more out of the British government this way. Mr. Jinnah's demand was based on a new theory he had recently propounded, that India consisted of two nations, Hindu and Muslim. Why only two I do not know, for if nationality was based on religion, then there were many nations in India. Of two brothers, one may be a Hindu, another a Muslim, they would belong to two different nations. These two nations existed in varying proportions in most of the villages of India. They were nations which had no boundaries, they overlapped. A Bengali Muslim and a Bengali Hindu living together, speaking the same language, and having much the same traditions and customs, belonged to different nations. All this was very difficult to grasp, it seemed a reversion to some medieval theory. What a nation is, it is difficult to define. Possibly the essential characteristic of national consciousness is a sense of belonging together, and of together facing the rest of mankind. How far that is present in India as a whole, may be a debatable point. It may even be said that India developed in the past as a multinational state and gradually acquired a national consciousness. But all these are theoretical abstractions which hardly concern us. Today, the most powerful states are multinational, but at the same time developing a national consciousness, like the USA or the USSR. From Mr. Jinnah's two-nation theory developed the conception of Pakistan, or splitting up of India. That, of course, did not solve the problem of the two nations, for they were all over the place. But that gave body to a metaphysical conception. This again gave rise to a passionate reaction among many in favor of the unity of India. Ordinarily, national unity is taken for granted. Only when it is challenged or attacked, or attempts are made to disrupt it, is unity really appreciated, and a positive reaction to maintain it takes place. Thus sometimes attempts at disruption actually help to weld that unity. There was a fundamental difference between the outlook of the Congress and that of the religious communal organizations. Of the latter, the chief were the Muslim League and its Hindu counterpart, the Hindu Mahasabha. These communal organizations, while in theory standing for India's independence, were more interested in claiming protection and special privileges for their respective groups. They had thus inevitably to look to the British government for such privileges, and this led them to avoid conflict with it. The Congress outlook was so tied up with India's freedom as a united nation that everything else was secondary, and this meant ceaseless conflict or friction with the British power. Indian nationalism, as represented by the Congress, opposed British imperialism. The Congress had further developed agrarian, economic, and social programs. Neither the Muslim League nor the Hindu Mahasabha had ever considered any such question or attempted to frame a program. Socialists and communists were, of course, intensely interested in such matters and had their own programs, which they tried to push in the Congress as well as outside. There was yet another marked difference between Congress policy and work, and those of the religious communal organizations. Quite apart from its agitational side and its legislative activity, when such existed, the Congress laid the greatest stress on certain constructive activities among the masses. These activities consisted in organizing and developing cottage industries, in raising the depressed classes, and later in the spread of basic education. Village work also included sanitation and some simple forms of medical relief. Separate organizations for carrying on these activities were created by the Congress, which functioned apart from the political plane, and which absorbed thousands of whole-time workers and a much larger number of part-time helpers. This quiet non-political, constructive work was carried on even when political activities were at a low ebb, but even this was suppressed by government when there was open conflict with the Congress. The economic value of some of these activities was questioned by a few people, but there could be no doubt of their social importance. They trained a large body of whole-time workers in intimate touch with the masses, and produced a spirit of self-help and self-reliance among the people. Congressmen and women also played an important part in trade union and agrarian organizations, actually building up many of these. The largest and best organized trade union, that of the Ahmedabad textile industry, was started by congressmen and worked in close cooperation with them. All these activities gave a solid background to Congress work, which was completely lacking in the religious communal organizations. These latter functioned on the agitational plane only by fits and starts, or during elections. In them also was lacking that ever-present sense of risk and personal danger from government action which congressmen had almost always to face. Thus, there was a far greater tendency for careerists and opportunists to enter these organizations. The two Muslim organizations, the Ahrar and the Jamiat-ul-Ulama, however, suffered greatly from governmental repression because politically they often followed the same line as the Congress. The Congress represented not only the nationalist urge of India, which had grown with the growth of the new bourgeoisie, but also, to a large extent, proletarian urges for social change. In particular, it stood for revolutionary agrarian changes. This sometimes produced inner conflicts within the Congress, and the landlord class and the big industrialists, though often nationalistic, kept aloof from it for fear of socialistic changes. Within the Congress, socialists and communists found a place and could influence Congress policy. The communal organizations, whether Hindu or Muslim, were closely associated with the feudal and conservative elements and were opposed to any revolutionary social change. The real conflict had, therefore, nothing to do with religion, though religion often masked the issue, but was essentially between those who stood for a nationalist, democratic, socially revolutionary policy and those who were concerned with preserving the relics of a feudal regime. In a crisis, the latter inevitably depend upon foreign support, which is interested in preserving the status quo. The beginning of World War II brought an internal crisis which resulted in the resignation of the Congress governments in the provinces. Before this occurred, however, the Congress made another attempt to approach Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League. Mr. Jinnah was invited to attend the first meeting of the Congress executive after the commencement of the war. He was unable to join us. We met him later, and tried to evolve a common policy in view of the world crisis. Not much progress was made, but nevertheless we decided to continue our talks. Meanwhile, the Congress governments resigned on the political issue, which had nothing to do with the Muslim League and the communal problem. Mr. Jinnah, however, chose that moment for a fierce attack on the Congress and a call on his league for the observance of a day of deliverance from Congress rule in the provinces. He followed this up by very unbecoming remarks on nationalist Muslims in the Congress and especially on the Congress president, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who was greatly respected among Hindus and Muslims alike. The Day of Deliverance was rather a flop, and counter-demonstrations among Muslims took place in some parts of India. But it added to bitterness and confirmed the conviction that Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League under his leadership had no intention whatever of coming to any settlement with the Congress, or of advancing the cause of Indian freedom. They preferred the existing situation. Footnote: after I had finished writing this book, I read a book by a Canadian scholar, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who has spent some years in Egypt and India. This book, which is called Modern Islam in India, A Social Analysis, Lahore, 1943, is an able analysis and careful survey of the development of ideas among Indian Muslims since the Indian Mutiny of 1857. He deals with the progressive and reactionary movements from Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's time onwards, and the different phases of the Muslim League. End of footnote. End of part 5, titled, The Question of Minorities. The Muslim League, Mr. Jinnah, of Chapter 8. Part 6, The National Planning Committee. Towards the end of 1938, a National Planning Committee was constituted at the instance of the Congress. It consisted of 15 members plus representatives of provincial governments and such Indian states as chose to collaborate with us. Among the members were well-known industrialists, financiers, economists, professors, scientists, as well as representatives of the Trade Union Congress and the Village Industries Association. The non-Congress provincial governments, Bengal, Punjab, and Sindh, as well as some of the major states, Hyderabad, Mysore, Baroda, Travancore, Bhopal, cooperated with this committee. In a sense, it was a remarkably representative committee cutting across political boundaries as well as the high barrier between official and non-official India, except for the fact that the government of India was not represented and took up a non-cooperative attitude. Hard-headed big business was there as well as people who are called idealists and doctrinaires, and socialists and near-communists. Experts and directors of industries came from provincial governments and states. It was a strange assortment of different types, and it was not clear how such an odd mixture would work. I accepted the chairmanship of the committee not without hesitation and misgiving. The work was after my own heart, and I could not keep out of it. Difficulties faced us at every turn. There were not enough data for real planning and few statistics were available. The government of India was not helpful. Even the provincial governments, though friendly and cooperative, did not seem to be particularly keen on all India planning and took only a distant interest in our work. They were far too busy with their own problems and troubles. Important elements in the Congress, under whose auspices the committee had come into existence, rather looked upon it as an unwanted child, not knowing how it would grow up and rather suspicious of its future activities. Big business was definitely apprehensive and critical, and probably joined up because it felt that it could look after its interests better from inside the committee than from outside. It was obvious also that any comprehensive planning could only take place under a free national government, strong enough and popular enough to be in a position to introduce fundamental changes in the social and economic structure. Thus, the attainment of national freedom and the elimination of foreign control became an essential prerequisite for planning. There were many other obstacles, our social backwardness, customs, traditional outlook, etc., but they had in any event to be faced. Planning thus was not so much for the present, as for an unascertained future, and there was an air of unreality about it. Yet it had to be based on the present, and we hoped that this future was not a distant one. If we could collect the available material, coordinate it, and draw up blueprints, we would prepare the ground for the real effective future planning, meanwhile indicating to provincial governments and states the lines on which they should proceed and develop their resources. The attempt to plan and to see the various national activities, economic, social, cultural, fitting into each other, had also a highly educative value for ourselves and the general public. It made the people come out of their narrow grooves of thought and action, to think of problems in relation to one another, and develop to some extent at least a wider cooperative outlook. The original idea behind the planning committee had been to further industrialization, the problems of poverty and unemployment, of national defense and of economic regeneration in general cannot be solved without industrialization. As a step towards such industrialization, a comprehensive scheme of national planning should be formulated. This scheme should provide for the development of heavy key industries, medium-scale industries, and cottage industries. But no planning could possibly ignore agriculture, which was the mainstay of the people. Equally important were the social services. So one thing led to another, and it was impossible to isolate anything or to progress in one direction without corresponding progress in another. The more we thought of this planning business, the vaster it grew in its sweep and range till it seemed to embrace almost every activity. That did not mean we intended regulating and regimenting everything, but we had to keep almost everything in view even in deciding about one particular sector of the plan. The fascination of this work grew upon me, and I think, upon the other members of our committee also. But at the same time certain vagueness and indefiniteness crept in. Instead of concentrating on some major aspects of the plan, we tended to become diffuse. This also led to delay in the work of many of our subcommittees, which lacked the sense of urgency and of working for a definite objective within a stated time. Constituted as we were, it was not easy for all of us to agree to any basic social policy or principles underlying social organization. Any attempt to discuss these principles in the abstract was bound to lead to fundamental differences of approach at the outset and possibly to a splitting up of the committee. Not to have such a guiding policy was a serious drawback, yet there was no help for it. We decided to consider the general problem of planning, as well as each individual problem concretely and not in the abstract, and allow principles to develop out of such considerations. Broadly speaking, there were two approaches, the socialist one aiming at the elimination of the profit motive and emphasizing the importance of equitable distribution, and the big business one striving to retain free enterprise and the profit motive as far as possible, and laying greater stress on production. There was also a difference in outlook between those who favored a rapid growth of heavy industry and others who wanted greater attention to be paid to the development of village and cottage industries, thus absorbing the vast number of the unemployed and partially employed. Ultimately, there were bound to be differences in the final conclusions. It did not very much matter even if there were two or more reports, provided that all the available facts were collected and coordinated, the common ground mapped out, and the divergencies indicated. When the time came for giving effect to the plan, the then existing democratic government would have to choose what basic policy to adopt. Meanwhile, a great deal of essential preparation would have been made and the various aspects of the problem placed before the public and the various provincial and state governments. Obviously, we could not consider any problem, much less plan, without some definite aim and social objective. That aim was declared to be to ensure an adequate standard of living for the masses, in other words, to get rid of the appalling poverty of the people. The irreducible minimum, in terms of money, had been estimated by economists at figures varying from 15 rupees to 25 rupees per capita per month. These are all pre-war figures. Compared to Western standards this was very low, and yet it meant an enormous increase in existing standards in India. An approximate estimate of the average annual income per capita was 65 rupees. This included the rich and the poor, the town dweller, and the villager. In view of the great gulf between the rich and the poor, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, the average income of the villager was estimated to be far less, probably about 30 rupees per capita per annum. These figures bring home the terrible poverty of the people and the destitute condition of the masses. There was lack of food, of clothing, of housing and of every other essential requirement of human existence. To remove this lack and ensure an irreducible minimum standard for everybody, the national income had to be greatly increased, and in addition to this increased production there had to be a more equitable distribution of wealth. We calculated that a really progressive standard of living would necessitate the increase of the national wealth by 500 or 600%. That was, however, too big a jump for us, and we aimed at a 200 to 300% increase within 10 years. We fixed a 10-year period for the plan, with control figures for different periods and different sectors of economic life. Certain objective tests were also suggested. 1. The improvement of nutrition, a balanced diet having a calorific value of 2,400 to 2,800 units for an adult worker. 2. Improvement in clothing from the then consumption of about 15 yards to at least 30 yards per capita per annum. 3. Housing standards to reach at least 100 square feet per capita. Further, certain indices of progress had to be kept in mind. 1. Increase in agricultural production. 2. Increase in industrial production. 3. Diminution of unemployment. 4. Increase in per capita income. 5. Liquidation of illiteracy. 6. Increase in public utility services. 7. Provision of medical aid on the basis of 1 unit for 1,000 population. 8. Increase in the average expectation of life. The objective for the country as a whole was the attainment, as far as possible, of national self-sufficiency. International trade was certainly not excluded, but we were anxious to avoid being drawn into the whirlpool of economic imperialism. We neither wanted to be victims of an imperialist power nor to develop such tendencies ourselves. The first charge on the country's produce should be to meet the domestic needs of food, raw materials, and manufactured goods. Surplus production would not be dumped abroad, but used in exchange for such commodities as we might require. To base our national economy on export markets might lead to conflicts with other nations and to sudden upsets when those markets were closed to us. So, though we did not start with a well-defined social theory, our social objectives were clear enough and afforded a common basis for planning. The very essence of this planning was a large measure of regulation and coordination. Thus, while free enterprise was not ruled out as such, its scope was severely restricted. In regard to defense industries, it was decided that they must be owned and controlled by the state. Regarding other key industries, the majority were of opinion that they should be state-owned, but a substantial minority of the committee considered that state control would be sufficient. Such control, however, of these industries had to be rigid. Public utilities, it was also decided, should be owned by some organ of the state, either the central government, provincial government, or a local board. It was suggested that something of the nature of the London Transport Board might control public utilities. In regard to other important and vital industries, no special rule was laid down, but it was made clear that the very nature of planning required control in some measure, which might vary with the industry. In regard to the agency and state-owned industries, it was suggested that as a general rule, an autonomous public trust would be suitable. Such a trust would ensure public ownership and control, and at the same time, avoid the difficulties and inefficiency, which sometimes creep in under direct democratic control. Cooperative ownership and control were also suggested for industries. Any planning would involve a close scrutiny of the development of industry and all its branches and a periodical survey of the progress made. It would mean also the training of the technical staffs necessary for the further expansion of industry, and the state might call upon industries to train such staffs. The general principles governing land policy were laid down. Agricultural land, mines, quarries, rivers, and forests are forms of national wealth, ownership of which must vest absolutely in the people of India collectively. The cooperative principle should be applied to the exploitation of land by developing collective and cooperative farms. It was not proposed, however, to rule out peasant farming in small holdings, to begin with at any rate, but no intermediaries of the type of taluktars, zamindars, etc., should be recognized after the transition period was over. The rights and title possessed by these classes should be progressively bought out. Collective farms were to be started immediately by the state on culturable waste land. Cooperative farming could be combined either with individual or joint ownership. A certain latitude was allowed for various types to develop so that, with greater experience, particular types might be encouraged more than others. We, or some of us at any rate, hope to evolve a socialized system of credit. If banks, insurance, etc., were not to be nationalized, they should at least be under the control of the state, thus leading to a state regulation of capital and credit. It was also desirable to control the export and import trade. By these various means a considerable measure of state control would be established in regard to land as well as in industry as a whole, though varying in particular instances, and allowing private initiative to continue in a restricted sphere. Thus, through the consideration of special problems, we gradually developed our social objectives and policy. There were gaps in them and occasional vagueness and even some contradiction. It was far from a perfect scheme in theory. But I was agreeably surprised at the large measure of unanimity achieved by us in spite of the incongruous elements in our committee. The big business element was the largest single group, and its outlook on many matters, especially financial and commercial, was definitely conservative. Yet the urge for rapid progress, and the conviction that only thus could we solve our problems of poverty and unemployment, were so great that all of us were forced out of our grooves and compelled to think on new lines. We had avoided a theoretical approach, and as each practical problem was viewed in its larger context, it led us inevitably in a particular direction. To me, the spirit of cooperation of the members of the planning committee was peculiarly soothing and gratifying, for I found it a pleasant contrast to the squabbles and conflicts of politics. We knew our differences, and yet we tried and often succeeded, after discussing every point of view, in arriving at an integrated conclusion, which was accepted by all of us, or most of us. Constituted as we were, not only in our committee, but in the larger field of India, we could not then plan for socialism as such. Yet it became clear to me that our plan, as it developed, was inevitably leading us towards establishing some of the fundamentals of the socialist structure. It was limiting the acquisitive factor in society, removing many of the barriers to growth, and thus leading to a rapidly expanding social structure. It was based on planning for the benefit of the common man, raising his standards greatly, giving him opportunities of growth, and releasing an enormous amount of latent talent and capacity. And all this was to be attempted in the context of democratic freedom and with a large measure of cooperation of some at least of the groups who were normally opposed to socialistic doctrine. That cooperation seemed to me worthwhile even if it involved toning down or weakening the plan in some respects. Probably, I was too optimistic. But so long as a big step in the right direction was taken, I felt that the very dynamics involved in the process of change would facilitate further adaptation and progress. If conflict was inevitable, it had to be faced, but if it could be avoided or minimized, that was an obvious gain. Especially, as in the political sphere there was conflict enough for us, and in the future, there might well be unstable conditions. A general consent for a plan was thus of great value. It was easy enough to draw up blueprints based on some idealist conception. It was much more difficult to get behind them that measure of general consent and approval, which was essential for the satisfactory working of any plan. Planning, though inevitably bringing about a great deal of control and coordination and interfering in some measure with individual freedom, would, as a matter of fact, in the context of India today, lead to a vast increase of freedom. We have very little freedom to lose. We have only to gain freedom. If we adhered to the democratic state structure and encouraged cooperative enterprises, many of the dangers of regimentation and concentration of power might be avoided. At our first sessions, we had framed a formidable questionnaire which was issued to various governments and public bodies, universities, chambers of commerce, trade unions, research institutes, etc. 29 subcommittees were also appointed to investigate and report on specific problems. 8 of these subcommittees were for agricultural problems, several were for industry, 5 for commerce and finance, 2 for transport, 2 for education, 2 for public welfare, 2 for demographic relations, and 1 for women's role in planned economy. There were in all about 350 members of these subcommittees, some of them overlapping. Most of them were specialists or experts in their subjects, businessmen, government, state, and municipal employees, university professors or lecturers, technicians, scientists, trade unionists, and policemen. We collected in this way much of the talent available in the country. The only persons who were not permitted to cooperate with us, even when they were personally desirous of doing so, were the officials and employees of the Government of India. To have so many persons associated in our work was helpful in many ways. We had the advantage of their special knowledge and experience, and they were led to think of their special subject in relation to the wider problem. It also led to a greater interest in planning all over the country. But these numbers were disadvantageous also, for there was inevitable delay when busy people spread out all over a vast country had to meet repeatedly. I was heartened to come into touch with so much ability and earnestness in all departments of national activity, and these contacts added to my own education greatly. Our method of work was to have an interim report from each subcommittee, which the planning committee considered, approving of it or partly criticizing it, and then sending it back with its remarks to the subcommittee. A final report was then submitted out of which arose our decisions on that particular subject. An attempt was being made continually to coordinate the decisions on each subject with those arrived at on other subjects. When all the final reports had been thus considered and disposed of, the Planning Committee was to review the whole problem in its vastness and intricacy and evolve its own comprehensive report, to which the subcommittee's reports would be added as appendices. As a matter of fact, that final report was gradually taking shape in the course of our consideration of the subcommittee's reports. There were irritating delays, chiefly due to some of the subcommittees not keeping to the timetable fixed for them, but on the whole we made good progress and got through an enormous amount of work. 2 interesting decisions were made in connection with education. We suggested that definite norms of physical fitness for boys and girls be laid down for every stage of education. We also suggested establishment of a system of compulsory social or labor service, so as to make every young man and woman contribute 1 year of his or her life, between the ages of 18 and 22, to national utility, including agriculture, industry, public utilities, and public works of all kinds. No exemption was to be allowed except for physical or mental disability. When World War II started in September 1939, it was suggested that the National Planning Committee should suspend its activities. In November the Congress governments and the provinces resigned, and this added to our difficulties, for under the absolute rule of the governors in the provinces, no interest was taken in our work. Businessmen were busier than ever making money out of war requirements, and were not so much interested in planning. The situation was changing from day to day. We decided, however, to continue and felt that the war made this even more necessary. It was bound to result in further industrialization, and the work we had already done, and were engaged in doing, could be of great help in this process. We were dealing then with our subcommittee's reports on engineering industries, transport, chemical industries, and manufacturing industries, all of the highest importance from the point of view of the war. But the government was not interested in our work, and in fact viewed it with great disfavor. During the early months of the war, the so-called phony period, their policy was not to encourage the growth of Indian industry. Afterwards, the pressure of events forced them to buy many of their requirements in India, but even so they disapproved of any heavy industries being started there. Disapproval meant virtual prohibition, for no machinery could be imported without government sanction. The Planning Committee continued its work and had nearly finished dealing with its subcommittee's reports. We were to finish what little remained of this work and then proceed to the consideration of our own comprehensive report. I was, however, arrested in October 1940 and sentenced to a long term of imprisonment. Several other members of the Planning Committee and its subcommittees were also arrested and sentenced. I was anxious that the Planning Committee should continue to function and requested my colleagues outside to do so. But they were not willing to work in the committee in my absence. I tried to get the Planning Committee's papers and reports in prison so that I might study them and prepare a draft report. The Government of India intervened and stopped this. No such papers were allowed to reach me, nor were interviews on the subject permitted. So the National Planning Committee languished, while I spent my days in jail. All the work we had done which, though incomplete, could be used to great advantage for war purposes, remained in the pigeonholes of our office. I was released in December 1941 and was out of prison for some months. But this period was a hectic one for me, as it was for others. All manner of new developments had taken place, the Pacific War was on, India was threatened with invasion, and it was not possible then to pick up the old threads and continue the unfinished work of the Planning Committee unless the political situation cleared up. And then, I returned to prison. End of Part 6, titled, The National Planning Committee, of Chapter 8. Part 7, The Congress and Industry, Big Industry versus Cottage Industry. The Congress, under Gandhiji's leadership, had long championed the revival of village industries, especially hand spinning and hand weaving. At no time, however, had the Congress been opposed to the development of big industries, and whenever it had the chance, in the legislatures or elsewhere, it had encouraged this development. Congress provincial governments were eager to do so. In the 20s, when the Tata Steel and Iron Works were in difficulties, it was largely due to the insistence of the Congress Party in the central legislature that government aid was given to help to tide over a critical period. The development of Indian shipbuilding and shipping services had long been a sore point of conflict between nationalist opinion and government. The Congress, as all other sections of Indian opinion, was anxious that every assistance should be given to Indian shipping. The government was equally anxious to protect the vested interests of powerful British shipping companies. Indian shipping was thus prevented from growing by official discrimination against it, although it had both capital and technical and managerial ability at its disposal. This kind of discrimination worked all along the line whenever any British industrial, commercial, or financial interests were concerned. That huge combine, the imperial chemical industries, has been repeatedly favored at the expenses of Indian industry. Some years ago, it was given a long-term lease for the exploitation of the minerals, etc., of the Punjab. The terms of this agreement were, so far as I know, not disclosed, presumably because it was not considered in the public interest to do so. The Congress provincial governments were anxious to develop a power alcohol industry. This was desirable from many points of view, but there was an additional reason in the United Provinces and Bihar. The large numbers of sugar factories there were producing as a byproduct a vast quantity of molasses which was being treated as waste material. It was proposed to utilize this for the production of power alcohol. The process was simple, there was no difficulty, except one: the interests of the Shell and Burma Oil Combine were affected. The Government of India championed these interests and refused to permit the manufacture of power alcohol. It was only in the third year of the present war, after Burma fell and the supplies of oil and petrol were cut off, that the realization came that power alcohol was necessary and must be produced in India. The American Grady Committee strongly urged this in 1942. The Congress has thus always been in favor of the industrialization of India, and at the same time, has emphasized the development of cottage industries and worked for this. Is there a conflict between these two approaches? Possibly there is a difference in emphasis, a realization of certain human and economic factors which were overlooked previously in India. Indian industrialists and the politicians who supported them thought too much in terms of the 19th century development of capitalist industry in Europe, and ignored many of the evil consequences that were obvious in the 20th century. In India, because normal progress had been arrested for 100 years, those consequences were likely to be more far-reaching. The kind of medium-scale industries that were being started in India, under the prevailing economic system, resulted not in absorbing labor, but in creating more unemployment. While capital accumulated at one end, poverty and unemployment increased at the other. Under a different system, with a stress on big-scale industries absorbing labor, and with planned development, this might well have been avoided. This fact of increasing mass poverty influenced Gandhi powerfully. It is true, I think, that there is a fundamental difference between his outlook on life generally and what might be called the modern outlook. He is not enamored of ever-increasing standards of living and the growth of luxury at the cost of spiritual and moral values. He does not favor the soft life. For him the straight way is the hard way, and the love of luxury leads to crookedness and loss of virtue. Above all, he is shocked at the vast gulf that stretches between the rich and the poor, in their ways of living, and their opportunities of growth. For his own personal and psychological satisfaction, he crossed that gulf and went over to the side of the poor, adopting, with only such improvements as the poor themselves could afford, their ways of living, their dress or lack of dress. This vast difference between the few rich and the poverty-stricken masses seemed to him to be due to two principal causes: foreign rule and the exploitation that accompanied it, and the capitalist industrial civilization of the West as embodied in the big machine. He reacted against both. He looked back with yearning to the days of the old autonomous and more or less self-contained village community where there had been an automatic balance between production, distribution, and consumption, where political or economic power was spread out and not concentrated as it is today, where a kind of simple democracy prevailed, where the gulf between the rich and the poor was not so marked, where the evil of great cities were absent and people lived in contact with the life-giving soil and breathed the pure air of the open spaces. There was all this basic difference in outlook as to the meaning of life itself between him and many others, and this difference colored his language as well as his activities. His language, vivid and powerful as it often was, drew its inspiration from the religious and moral teachings of the ages, principally of India but also of other countries. Moral values must prevail, the ends can never justify unworthy means, or else the individual and the race perish. And yet he was no dreamer living in some fantasy of his own creation, cut off from life and its problems. He came from Gujarat, the home of hard-headed businessmen, and he had an unrivaled knowledge of the Indian villages and the conditions of life that prevailed there. It was out of that personal experience that he evolved his program of the spinning wheel and village industry. If immediate relief was to be given to the vast numbers of the unemployed and partially employed, if the rot that was spreading throughout India and paralyzing the masses was to be stopped, if the villagers' standards were to be raised, however, little en masse, if they were to be taught self-reliance instead of waiting helplessly like derelicts for relief from others, if all this was to be done without much capital, then there seemed no other way. Apart from the evils inherent in foreign rule and exploitation, and the lack of freedom to initiate and carry through big schemes of reform, the problem of India was one of scarcity of capital and abundance of labor, how to utilize that wasted labor, that manpower that was producing nothing. Foolish comparisons are made between manpower and machine power. Of course, a big machine can do the work of 1,000 or 10,000 persons. But if those 10,000 sit idly by or starve, the introduction of the machine is not a social gain, except in long perspective which envisages a change in social conditions. When the big machine is not there at all, then no question of comparison arises. It is a net gain both from the individual and the national point of view to utilize manpower for production. There is no necessary conflict between this and the introduction of machinery on the largest scale, provided that machinery is used primarily for absorbing labor and not for creating fresh unemployment. Comparisons between India and the small highly industrialized countries of the West, or big countries with relatively sparse populations, like the USSR or the USA, are misleading. In Western Europe the process of industrialization has proceeded for 100 years, and gradually the population has adjusted itself to it. The population has grown rapidly, then stabilized itself, and is now declining. In the USA and the USSR there are vast tracts with a small, though growing, population. A tractor is an absolute necessity there to exploit the land for agriculture. It is not so obvious that a tractor is equally necessary in the densely populated Gangetic Valley, so long as vast numbers depend on the land alone for sustenance. Other problems arise, as they have arisen even in America. Agriculture has been carried on for thousands of years in India and the soil has been exploited to the utmost. Would the deep churning up of the soil by tractors lead to impoverishment of this soil as well as to soil erosion? When railways were built in India and high embankments put up for the purpose, no thought was given to the natural drainage of the country. The embankments interfered with this drainage system, and as a result, we have had repeated and ever-increasing floods and soil erosion, and malaria has spread. I am all for tractors and big machinery, and I am convinced that the rapid industrialization of India is essential to relieve the pressure on land, to combat poverty and raise standards of living, for defense and a variety of other purposes. But I am equally convinced that the most careful planning and adjustment are necessary if we are to reap the full benefit of industrialization and avoid many of its dangers. This planning is necessary today in all countries of arrested growth, like China and India, which have strong traditions of their own. In China, I was greatly attracted to the industrial cooperatives, the Indusco movement, and it seems to me that some such movement is peculiarly suited to India. It would fit in with the Indian background, give a democratic basis to small industry, and develop the cooperative habit. It could be made to complement big industry. It must be remembered that, however rapid might be the development of heavy industry in India, a vast field will remain open to small and cottage industries. Even in Soviet Russia, owner-producer cooperatives have played an important part in industrial growth. The increasing use of electric power facilitates the growth of small industry and makes it economically capable of competing with large-scale industry. There is also a growing opinion in favor of decentralization, and even Henry Ford had advocated it. Scientists are pointing out the psychological and biological dangers of loss of contact with the soil which results from life in great industrial cities. Some have even said that human survival necessitates a going back to the soil and the village. Fortunately, science has made it possible today for populations to be spread out and remain near the soil and yet enjoy all the amenities of modern civilization and culture. However that may be, the problem before us in India during recent decades has been how, in the existing circumstances and restricted as we were by alien rule and its attendant vested interests, we could relieve the poverty of the masses and produce a spirit of self-reliance among them. There are many arguments in favor of developing cottage industries at any time, but situated as we were, that was certainly the most practical thing we could do. The methods adopted may not have been the best or the most suitable. The problem was vast, difficult, and intricate, and we had frequently to face suppression by government. We had to learn gradually by the process of trial and error. I think we should have encouraged cooperatives from the beginning, and relied more on expert technical and scientific knowledge for the improvement of small machines suitable for cottage and village use. The cooperation principle is now being introduced in these organizations. G.D.H. Cole, the economist, has said that Gandhi's campaign for the development of the homemade cloth industry is no mere fad of a romantic eager to revive the past, but a practical attempt to relieve the poverty and uplift the standard of the village. It was that undoubtedly, and it was much more. It forced India to think of the poor peasant in human terms, to realize that behind the glitter of a few cities lay this morass of misery and poverty, to grasp the fundamental fact that the true test of progress and freedom in India did not lie in the creation of a number of millionaires or prosperous lawyers and the like, or in the setting up of councils and assemblies, but in the change in the status and conditions of life of the peasant. The British had created a new caste or class in India, the English-educated class, which lived in a world of its own, cut off from the mass of the population, and looked always, even when protesting, towards its rulers. Gandhi bridged that gap to some extent, and forced it to turn its head and look towards its own people. Gandhiji's attitude to the use of machinery seemed to undergo a gradual change. "What I object to," he said, "is the craze for machinery, not machinery as such. If we could have electricity in every village home, I shall not mind villagers plying their implements and tools with electricity." The big machines seem to him to lead inevitably, at least in the circumstances of today, to the concentration of power and riches. I consider it a sin and injustice to use machinery for the purpose of concentration of power and riches in the hands of the few. Today the machine is used in this way. He even came to accept the necessity of many kinds of heavy industries and large-scale key industries and public utilities, provided they were state-owned and did not interfere with some kinds of cottage industries which he considered as essential. Referring to his own proposals, he said, "The whole of this program will be a structure on sand if it is not built on the solid foundation of economic equality." Thus, even the enthusiastic advocates for cottage and small-scale industries recognize that big-scale industry is, to a certain extent, necessary and inevitable, only they would like to limit it as far as possible. Superficially, then the question becomes one of emphasis and adjustment of the two forms of production and economy. It can hardly be challenged that in the context of the modern world, no country can be politically and economically independent, even within the framework of international interdependence, unless it is highly industrialized and has developed its power resources to the utmost. Nor can it achieve or maintain high standards of living and liquidate poverty without the aid of modern technology in almost every sphere of life. An industrially backward country will continually upset the world equilibrium and encourage the aggressive tendencies of more developed countries. Even if it retains its political independence, this will be nominal only, and economic control will tend to pass to others. This control will inevitably upset its own small-scale economy which it has sought to preserve in pursuit of its own view of life. Thus, an attempt to build up a country's economy largely on the basis of cottage and small-scale industries is doomed to failure. It will not solve the basic problems of the country or maintain freedom, nor will it fit in with the world framework, except as a colonial appendage. Is it possible to have two entirely different kinds of economy in a country, one based on the big machine and industrialization, and the other mainly on cottage industries? This is hardly conceivable, for one must overcome the other, and there can be little doubt that the big machine will triumph unless it is forcibly prevented from doing so. Thus, it is not a mere question of adjustment of the two forms of production and economy. One must be dominating and paramount, with the other as complementary to it, fitting in where it can. The economy based on the latest technical achievements of the day must necessarily be the dominating one. If technology demands the big machine, as it does today in a large measure, then the big machine with all its implications and consequences must be accepted. Where it is possible, in terms of that technology, to decentralize production, this would be desirable. But, in any event, the latest technique has to be followed, and to adhere to outworn and out-of-date methods of production, except as a temporary and stopgap measure, is to arrest growth and development. Any argument as to the relative merits of small-scale and large-scale industry seems strangely irrelevant today, when the world, and the dominating facts of the situation that confront it, have decided in favor of the latter. Even in India the decision has been made by these facts themselves, and no one doubts that India will be rapidly industrialized in the near future. She has already gone a good way in that direction. The evils of unrestricted and unplanned industrialization are well recognized today. Whether these evils are necessary concomitants of big industry, or derived from the social and economic structure behind it, is another matter. If the economic structure is primarily responsible for them, then surely we should set about changing that structure, instead of blaming the inevitable and desirable development in technique. The real question is not one of quantitative adjustment and balancing of various incongruous elements and methods of production, but a qualitative changeover to something different and new, from which various social consequences flow. The economic and political aspects of this qualitative change are important, but equally important are the social and psychological aspects. In India, especially, where we have been wedded far too long to past forms and modes of thought and action, new experiences, new processes, leading to new ideas and new horizons, are necessary. Thus, we will change the static character of our living and make it dynamic and vital, and our minds will become active and adventurous. New situations lead to new experiences, as the mind is compelled to deal with them and adapt itself to a changing environment. It is well recognized now that a child's education should be intimately associated with some craft or manual activity. The mind is stimulated thereby and there is a coordination between the activities of the mind and the hands. So also the mind of a growing boy or girl is stimulated by the machine. It grows under the machine's impact, under proper conditions, of course, and not as an exploited and unhappy worker in a factory, and opens out new horizons. Simple scientific experiments, peeps into the microscope, and an explanation of the ordinary phenomena of nature bring excitement in their train, an understanding of some of life's processes, and a desire to experiment and find out instead of relying on set phrases and old formulae. Self-confidence and the cooperative spirit grow, and frustration, arising out of the miasma of the past, lessens. A civilization based on ever-changing and advancing mechanical techniques leads to this. Such a civilization is a marked change, a jump almost from the older type, and is intimately connected with modern industrialization. Inevitably, it gives rise to new problems and difficulties, but it also shows the way to overcome them. I have a partiality for the literary aspects of education, and I admire the classics, but I am quite sure that some elementary scientific training in physics and chemistry, and especially biology, as also in the application of science, is essential for all boys and girls. Only thus can they understand and fit into the modern world and develop, to some extent at least, the scientific temper. There is something very wonderful about the high achievements of science and modern technology, which no doubt will be bettered in the near future, in the superb ingenuity of scientific instruments, in the amazingly delicate and yet powerful machines, in all that has flowed from the adventurous inquiries of science and its applications, in the glimpses into the fascinating workshop and processes of nature, in the fine sweep of science, through its myriad workers, in the realms of thought and practice, and, above all, in the fact that all this has come out of the mind of man. End of Part 7, titled, The Congress and Industry. Big Industry versus Cottage Industry, of Chapter 8. Part 8, Government Checks Industrial Growth. War production is diversion from normal production. Heavy industry was represented in India by the Tata Iron and Steel Works at Jamshedpur. There was nothing else of the kind, and the other engineering workshops were really jobbing shops. Even the development of Tatas had been slow because of government policy. During World War I, when there was a shortage of locomotives and railway carriages and wagons, Tatas decided to make locomotives, and, I think, even imported machinery for the purpose. But when the war ended, the Government of India and the Railway Board, which is a department of the central government, decided to continue their patronage of British locomotives. There is obviously no private market for locomotives, as the railways were either controlled by government or owned by British companies, and so, Tatas had to give up the idea of making locomotives. The three fundamental requirements of India, if she is to develop industrially and otherwise, are a heavy engineering and machine-making industry, scientific research institutes, and electric power. These must be the foundations of all planning, and the National Planning Committee laid the greatest emphasis on them. We lacked all three, and bottlenecks in industrial expansion were always occurring. A forward policy could have rapidly removed these bottlenecks, but the government's policy was the reverse of forward and was obviously one of preventing the development of heavy industry in India. Even when World War II started, the necessary machinery was not allowed to be imported. Later shipping difficulties were pleaded. There was neither lack of capital nor skilled personnel in India, only machinery was lacking, and industrialists were clamoring for it. If opportunities had been given for the importation of machinery, not only would the economic position of India have been infinitely better, but the whole aspect of the war in the Far Eastern theatres might have changed. Many of the essential articles, which had to be brought over, usually by air and at great cost and under considerable difficulties, could have been manufactured in India. India would have really become an arsenal for China and the East, and her industrial progress might have matched that of Canada or Australia. But imperative as the needs of the war situation were, the future needs of British industry were always kept in view, and it was considered undesirable to develop any industries in India which might compete with British industries in the post-war years. This was no secret policy, public expression was given to it in British journals, and there was continuous reference to it and protests against it in India. Jamshedji Tata, the far-sighted founder of Tata Steel, had vision enough to start the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. This research institute was one of the very few of its kind in India, the others were some government institutions with limited objectives. The vast field of scientific and industrial research, which has thousands of institutes, academies, and special stations in the USA and the Soviet Union, was thus almost wholly neglected in India, except for the Bangalore Institute and some work done in the universities. An effort was made, sometime after World War II started, to encourage research, and though limited in scope, it has produced good results. While shipbuilding and locomotive manufacture were discouraged and prevented, an effort to build up an automobile industry was also scotched. Some years before World War II, preparations were started for this, and everything was worked out in cooperation with a famous American firm of automobile manufacturers. A number of assembly plants had already been functioning in India. It was now proposed to manufacture all the parts in India with Indian capital and management and Indian personnel. By arrangement with the American corporation, their patents could be used and their skilled and technical supervision was available for the initial period. The provincial government of Bombay, which was then functioning under a Congress ministry, promised assistance in various ways. The planning committee was especially interested in this project. Everything in fact had been fixed up, and all that remained was to import the machinery. The Secretary of State for India, however, did not approve and gave his fiat against the importation of the machinery. According to him, any attempt to set up this industry now would divert both labor and machinery, which are more urgently needed for the war. This was in the early months of the war, during the so-called phony period. It was pointed out that plenty of labor, even skilled labor, was available and in fact was idle. War necessity was also a curious argument, for that necessity itself demanded motor transport. But the Secretary of State for India, the final authority, sitting in London, was not moved by these arguments. It was reported also that a rival and powerful automobile corporation in America did not approve of the starting of an automobile industry in India under someone else's auspices. Transport became one of the major problems of the war in India. There was the lack of motor trucks, of petroleum, of locomotives and railway wagons, even of coal. Almost all these difficulties would have been much easier of solution if the pre-war proposals on behalf of India had not been turned down. Locomotives, railway cars, motor trucks, as well as armored vehicles would have been manufactured in India. Power alcohol would have helped greatly in easing the strain caused by scarcity of petroleum. As for coal, there was no scarcity in India. There were huge reserves, but only very little was produced for use. Coal production has actually gone down during the war years in spite of increased demand. Conditions in coal mines were so bad and wages so low that workers were not attracted. Ultimately, the bar on women working underground was removed as women were available at those wages. No attempt was made to overhaul the coal industry and improve conditions and wages so as to attract workers. Owing to lack of coal, the expansion of industry has suffered greatly and even existing factories have had to stop working. Some hundreds of locomotives and many thousands of railway cars were shipped from India to the Middle East, thus adding to the transport difficulties in India. Even the permanent way was uprooted in some places for transfer elsewhere. The casual way in which all this was done, without any regard to future consequences, was amazing. There was a complete lack of planning and foresight, and the partial solution of one problem led immediately to more serious problems. An attempt was made at the end of 1939 or the beginning of 1940 to start an aircraft manufacturing industry in India. Again, everything was fixed up with an American firm and urgent cables were sent to the Government of India and Army headquarters in India for their consent. There was no response. After repeated reminders, a reply was forthcoming disapproving of the scheme. Why make aeroplanes in India when you could buy them in England and America? In pre-war days, a large number of medicines and drugs and vaccines used to come to India from Germany. War stopped this. It was immediately suggested that some of the more essential vaccines and medicines might be made in India. This could easily be done in some of the government institutes. The government of India did not approve and pointed out that everything that was necessary could now be obtained through imperial chemical industries. When it was suggested that the same thing could be made in India at much less cost, and utilized for army as well as general public use without any private interest, high authority was indignant at the intrusion of such base considerations in matters of state policy. Government, it was said, was not a commercial institution. Government was not a commercial institution, but it was very much interested in commercial institutions, and one of these was Imperial Chemicals. This huge combine was given many facilities. Even without such facilities, it had such enormous resources that no Indian firm, except to some extent, Tata's, could possibly compete with it. Apart from these facilities, it had powerful support both in India and England. A few months after leaving the Viceroyalty of India, Lord Linlithgow appeared in a new role as a Director of Imperial Chemicals. This demonstrates the very close connection between big business in England and the Government of India, and how this connection must necessarily affect policy. Lord Linlithgow may have been a substantial shareholder in Imperial Chemicals even when he was Viceroy of India. In any event, he has now placed the prestige of his Indian connection and his special knowledge derived as Viceroy at the disposal of Imperial Chemicals. Lord Linlithgow declared as Viceroy in December 1942, "We have achieved immense things in the field of supply. India has made a contribution of outstanding importance and value. For the first 6 months of the war, the value of contracts placed was approximately 29 crores. For the next months from April to October 1942, it was 137 crores. Over the whole period to the end of October 1942, it was no less than 428 crores, and these figures exclude the value of work done in the ordnance factories, which is in itself very considerable. Footnote: the figures are in rupees. A crore is 10 millions. End of footnote. This is perfectly true, and India's contribution to the war effort has grown tremendously since this was said. One would imagine that this represents a vast increase in industrial activity and a much larger index of production. Yet, surprisingly, there has not been much change. The index of India's industrial activity in 1938-39 was 111.1, taking 1935 as 100. In 1939-40 it was 114.0. In 1940-41 it varied between 112.1 to 127.0. In March 1942, it was 118.9. It fell in April 1942 to 109.2, and then gradually rose to 116.2 in July 1942. These figures are not complete as they do not include munitions and some chemical industries. Nevertheless, they are important and significant. The amazing fact emerges that the total industrial activity of India in July 1942 was, apart from munitions, etc., only slightly in excess of the pre-war period. There was a brief spurt in December 1941 when the index figure went up to 127.0 and then declined. And yet, the value of government contracts placed with industries was progressively increasing. For the 6 months, October to March 1939-40, these contracts amounted to 290 million rupees, according to Lord Linlithgow, and for the 6 months April to October 1942, they were for 1,370 million rupees. All these tremendous war orders thus do not represent any increase in the total industrial activity, but indicate its large-scale diversion from normal production to production for specialized war purposes. For the moment they supplied war needs, but at the cost of a terrific lowering of production for civilian needs. This inevitably had far-reaching consequences. While sterling balances in favor of India grew in London, and money accumulated in the hands of a few persons in India, the country as a whole was starved of essential needs, vast and ever-increasing quantities of paper money circulated, and prices went up and sometimes reached fantastic figures. Already by the middle of 1942, a food crisis was evident. In the autumn of 1943, famine killed its millions in Bengal and other parts of India. The burden of the war and of the official policy pursued in its connection fell on scores of millions in India who were least capable of shouldering it, and crushed out of existence vast numbers of people who died by the cruelest of deaths, slow starvation. The figures I have given end with 1942, I have no later ones. Probably many changes have taken place since then and the index of India's industrial activity may be higher now. Footnote: it is not so. The Calcutta Journal, Capital, of March 9, 1944, gives the following figures for the index of industrial activity in India. 1935-36 equals 100, 1938-39, 111.1. 1939-40, 114.0. 1940-41, 117.3. 1941-42, 122.7. 1942-43, 108.8. 1943-44, 108.0, approximately. 1944, January, 111.7. These do not include armament production. Thus, after more than 4 years of war, industrial activity as a whole in India was actually somewhat lower than in the pre-war period. End of footnote. But the picture they reveal has not changed in any fundamental aspect. The same processes are at work, the same crises follow one after the other, the same patchwork and temporary remedies are applied, the same lack of any planned and comprehensive outlook is evident, the same partiality for the present and future of British industry prevails, and meanwhile people continue to die from lack of food and from epidemics. It is true that some of the existing industries, notably the textile, the iron and steel, and the jute industries, have prospered exceedingly. The number of millionaires among industrial magnates, war contractors, hoarders, and profiteers has grown, and large sums have accumulated in the hands of small upper strata of India's people, in spite of a heavy super tax. But labor generally has not profited, and Mr. N.M. Joshi, the labor leader, declared in the Central Assembly that labor conditions in India had become worse during the war. Landowners and middle farmers, especially in the Punjab and Sindh, have prospered, but the great majority of the agricultural population have been hard hit by war conditions and have suffered greatly. Consumers generally have been progressively ground down by inflation and the rise in prices. In the middle of 1942, an American technical mission, the Grady Committee, came to India to inspect the existing industries and make suggestions for increased production. They were naturally concerned with production for war purposes only. Their report was never published, possibly because the government of India vetoed publication. A few of their recommendations were, however, announced. They suggested the production of power alcohol, the expansion of the steel industry, more electric power, greater production of aluminium and refined sulfur, and rationalization in various industries. They also recommended the institution of high-powered control of production, independent of established government agencies, on the American model. Evidently, the Grady Committee was not filled with admiration for the leisurely, casual, and inefficient methods of the government of India, on which even total war had produced little impression. They were struck, however, by the efficiency and organization of the Tata Steel Works, a vast organization run entirely by Indians. It was further stated in the preliminary report of the Grady Committee that the mission has been impressed with the good quality and excellent potentiality of Indian labor. The Indian is skillful with his hands, and given satisfactory working conditions and security of employment, is dependable and industrious. Footnote, commenting on the shelving of the Grady Committee's report, Commerce, Bombay, November 28, 1942, wrote, "The fact remains that powerful interests are operating abroad for the purpose of throttling further industrialization of this country, so that in the post-war world there would not be any dangerous competition to the West from the East." End of footnote. During the last 2 or 3 years the chemical industry has grown in India, shipbuilding has made some advance, and an infant aircraft industry has been started. All war industries, including jute and textile mills, have made vast profits, in spite of the super tax, and a great deal of capital has accumulated. The government of India had put a ban on capital issues for fresh industrial undertakings. Recently, there has been some relaxation in this respect, though nothing definite may be done till after the war. Even this little relaxation has led to a burst of energy from big business and huge industrial schemes are taking shape. India, whose growth has so long been arrested, appears to be on the verge of large-scale industrialization. End of Part 8, titled, Government Checks Industrial Growth, War Production is Diversion from Normal Production, of Chapter 8. This concludes the 8th chapter, titled, The Last Phase, 2.